So today's session is a continuation of our conversations about broadband and how we can connect our residents to the digital resources that they need to live full lives, and the ways that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and other federal resources have been helping us to bridge the digital divide. Today's session is part of our Tech and Innovation series, which really focuses on what are those technologies and innovative practices that we're seeing in cities take hold, and ways of being able to access and deploy federal resources. Just as a reminder about some of our values, we are focused in this series on technology solutions, but really about that solutions is sort of the underline. It's not technology for tech's sake, but where can technology help us to meet our community goals? We designed this series specifically with the practitioners in mind who are going to need to deploy these solutions. So how can we bring you the ideas that are being spearheaded in other cities so that you can learn about them and ask on the ground questions about how things are going and hear the good, the bad, the ugly, what people found in their testing of these things. So hopefully when you go to deploy these solutions, you're better placed. We also are always trying to think about what are sustainable models for doing this work. We don't want these to be one-offs, but really solutions that you can adopt throughout your communities. And most importantly, whenever technology solutions are being deployed, we want to make sure that they're built for trust, that they're thinking about data privacy, they're thinking about security. We keep seeing in our communities and our city governments, cyber attacks and other ways that that digital resources can run into interference. And so how do we make sure that what we're doing is reliable and durable and safe? Next slide. And with that, it's really helpful in these conversations to just get a pulse of where the audience already is in broadband deployment, in thinking about solutions, for instance, for multi-dwelling housing. And so we're just going to launch a poll to learn a little bit more about you all today. And you can be filling that out while I toss it over to Anthony Townsend at Cornell Tech, who's going to talk to us more about the goals of today's session. Anthony?
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everybody, on this summer afternoon. So the goal of today's session is to really try to dig into the broadband funding opportunity, the broadband opportunity that was presented by the federal infrastructure programs, acknowledging that these programs, the BEAD program, Broadband Equity, Access and Deployment, and the Digital Equity program are not necessarily as direct tools for cities to access federal funding. Those programs are being delivered primarily through states, and each state is going through its own iteration of that process. So with all of that in mind, what we wanted to do was sort of try to broaden out the framework a little bit and take a look at how the nonprofit sector, and particularly two organizations, one working nationally and one working locally, are trying to fill in some of the gaps that are being created in the market and that are not fully being addressed by all the funding mechanisms we have in place. And really just to take this as an opportunity to look at some emerging technologies and ways of deploying technology, as well as some creative strategies that cities might use to try to supplement what they're already doing with federal broadband funding through their state government. So it's really, I think, an opportunity to go a little bit beyond some of the immediate funding sources that we've been looking at, and looking at how those might fit into bigger kind of multifaceted strategies that cities can help advance to close these broadband gaps. So with that said, if we could go to the next slide real quickly. I want to invite our friends from Education Superhighway, Adienka Ogunlegan, who's the VP of Government Affairs, and Tony Schloss, who's the general manager for the apartment Wi-Fi program, to just help set the context a little bit. And we'll start with Arienka. And maybe you could just help us get an overview of what are the challenges that cities are facing when it comes to digital divide, particularly around multifamily housing, which we know is an area where there have been lots of challenges.
No, thank you, Anthony. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to be a part of this discussion, but also I think your question is very right on point. We know that the digital divide existed prior to the pandemic. We also know that there are unique challenges in terms of addressing the needs of unconnected households and multifamily housing. In addition to the traditional challenges of access that most people think of in rural communities, there are also access challenges in urban and suburban communities where a lot of these multifamily housing dwellings are located. As an organization, Education Superhighway is focused on what we call closing the broadband affordability gap. And we know 20 to 25% of that, the households that fall into that broadband affordability gap live in multifamily housing. So we are keenly aware and very concerned on developing programmatic solutions that can address that need. Right now in this landscape, we know that there's lots of federal funding available through the Infrastructure Act and various other programs. We've been really focused on educating states on how to set up programs and run those programs effectively to identify the needs in multifamily housing and then deploy solutions like what we call apartment Wi-Fi to address those gaps. We know that it's hard for cities to access that funding working directly with their state broadband offices. So we've been primarily focused on structuring those programs in a way that makes it easier for cities to be recipients of grant funding, but also to inform how those programs come together and the specific needs within their communities, the MDUs that might not be covered explicitly by programs like BEAD, that states have a unique opportunity to be creative in how they deploy those dollars.
Jake, do you think you could, we had a few slides that Arienka had wanted to share. I just want to make sure we have those available.
Oh, thank you, Jake. Yeah, so as I said, 20 to 25% of the digital divide is concentrated in affordable multi-dwelling units. That's about 6 million people or 3.7 million households. They live in various states. It's not just states with large urban populations. We've identified MDUs in every state in the country where there is an opportunity to connect unconnected households. Next slide. But the barriers that persist in the digital divide are even more concentrated in affordable and public housing specifically. We know that affordability is a challenge. Usually retail market rate internet service is out of the reach of many households that live in affordable and public housing MDUs. It can also be very difficult for those households to sign up for be it a low-cost broadband adoption program or the retail service, given things like bad debt or lack of language support, long-term contracts that may be barriers to enrollment. And then a lot of providers that do not specifically focus on the needs of households in affordable housing, they don't invest in upgrading the infrastructure in those spaces to make sure that adequate speeds are available to those households. So due to what the industry perceives as high churn or customer credit issues, these are not seen as attractive customer bases as well.
Thanks. And can you just say a little bit about sort of how, as a category, multifamily housing has kind of fallen between the cracks in some of the existing both federal and state programs and efforts to try to expand connectivity?
Sure. Specifically, we've been, as an organization, spent a lot of time on making sure that affordable housing and MDUs were a permissible use of state BEAD dollars. But even within that program, the challenge there is that the BEAD dollars are meant to connect unserved, underserved locations, as well as community anchor institutions. However, using data from the National Broadband Map, an MDU is identified as one broadband serviceable location. So 120 Main Street, apartment building A is not accounted for. It's just 120 Main Street. The entire apartment building is treated as one BSL. It does not take into account the unconnected households that live within that MDU. So it's treated the same way as a single family home, not necessarily recognizing the lack of access within that building. we've done a lot of education to state broadband offices to get them to understand that while they may be called upon to connect an unserved MDU as one BSL, they really need to be looking at solutions that make sure that the households within that building, every single one of them, has a connectivity solution. Same thing with other funding programs as well. We've been really elevating the needs of unconnected households to make sure that no home is left offline.
And Education Superhighway has one such solution, which you guys are calling apartment Wi-Fi. Can you just tell us a little bit before we hand off to Tony, or maybe both of you can field this, like how this approach came about and how the program got started, and why you're pursuing it?
Sure, I'll kick it off and then hand off to Tony.
Sure.
Like I said, starting with data, recognizing that a high concentration of unconnected households live in MDUs, we started brainstorming what are the most cost-effective ways to address the connectivity needs of these households. We're all familiar with accessing Wi-Fi in public spaces like hotels, Starbucks. We all know how to do it. And the idea that we can create an instant-on experience for households that live in multifamily housing, especially the housing segment that is often overlooked, public and affordable housing, we see that as a cost-effective solution of federal resources and even private resources. It's not something that has been considered attractive, but it is something that we know operates in the multifamily housing space, especially in market rate and luxury housing. There is no need why that cannot be the case in affordable and public housing as well. So we initially started by piloting it with some properties in Oakland to assess the feasibility of this, working with managed service providers in those communities, in some instances being the service provider ourselves, to test the model and determine the cost effectiveness of it. And we saw some initial success and have now been sharing that success and model with others. But I'll turn it over to Tony to get into specifics.
Great. And as Tony comes off mute, I just want to encourage folks in the audience, as you have questions, feel free to share them in the chat, and we will either invite you to come on screen and ask that question in a little bit, or we'll pass them on to the speakers for you. So Tony, what does this look like? How do you actually go into a building and make a plan and build a network?
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. Great name. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's right. So it's relatively simple. What the lead would do, the building owner or whoever's leading this project would secure a fiber connection to the building, and then through that would be an ISP that would bring that there, and through the use of a managed service provider, the managed service provider would build the interior infrastructure. And you can see in this image, hopefully it's large enough for everyone, you bring the fiber in, most likely and probably most resiliently, into the basement. You run it up conduit vertically, and then into sort of server rooms or mechanical rooms on each floor, and put access points in the hallway. So as I mentioned, there's an ISP involved, there's an MSP, a managed service provider. That MSP will probably subcontract with a cabling installer, and of course there's the owner who oversees it, most likely with the support of a funder. Though, as Adinka mentions, in market rate MDUs, this is happening already, to a great degree. As Adinka mentioned, in Oakland, the ISP ended up, in some cases, was actually the municipal network, which saved costs and was a really interesting approach. There were benefits and challenges to working with Oakland Wi-Fi in that case. I'll say, the building type is important. The number of units is important, and the type of, the material construction. The number of units is important for to figuring out the efficiencies of the cost. But then you also need to know who lives in the building and how many devices they may have to understand how much bandwidth you may need. But then even more so, the building materials will dictate what works. So, and one example I'd like to share is in Massachusetts, we're supporting their two programs they have from their capital project funds, which is, one is an apartment Wi-Fi, just as we see here, and the other is called the residential retrofit, which brings fiber all the way to the unit. So we, as we recruit building owners to enter the pipeline of these programs, we do site surveys and we understand if their property is a better fit for the apartment Wi-Fi program or the residential retrofit program. At one point, I want to mention mesh networks, because at one point this was the topic, and mesh networks are being used in a lot of areas, but they are challenging to use in the conventional sense for home connectivity, because the sort of bandwidth usage varies so greatly. So the true mesh, where an access point acts as a sender and receiver at the same time, works when the data being transferred is standardized. So in Scottsdale, for example, they are using a mesh network for their traffic cameras, and that works pretty well because it's a standard rate going through all of those devices. But it gets more challenging elsewhere, and you can do it in small places, or you can do a sort of a hybrid mesh. The New York City Housing and Preservation and Development Department is in the early stages of building a network in Manhattan, northern Manhattan and Bronx, which will bring buildings online, and you can build the network out further by building off of the original buildings.
And so just, Tony, just to put that in the context of this diagram that you're showing, like a mesh approach would eliminate that last little wire sort of running from the cabinets on each floor to the radios. And what you're saying is basically like the drawbacks of that approach don't really outweigh like the investment, the benefits of running a wire to each of those radios, each of those access points on each floor.
Yes, that's true. And that's exactly right. And there are now ISPs who are building those mesh solutions for oftentimes for private homeowners, but they work as well, and they're moving into the MDU space. But that's exactly right. The access points serve to spread the connection as well as provide it to the users.
And what kinds of, like for the end user, a setup like this compared to, the much costlier build out of running, I don't know if it would be fiber into each dwelling unit or a high capacity cable. Like what's the difference in sort of the end user performance, whether it's speed, security, latency, those kinds of technical performance criteria? Do they even know the difference?
I mean, I think today, no. For the usage rates of today, I don't think anyone would experience an issue. Hopefully many of us have stayed in hotels, and you don't generally run into a problem if you're having a meeting or downloading or watch streaming. There is careful planning that's necessary, right? Because the real issue is you're bringing in the fiber connection that must provide enough bandwidth to be shared at all times across all units. But with careful planning, that any challenges there can be avoided.
But yeah, I just want to make sure everybody knows this isn't like a sort of like substandard internet connection.
Oh, no.
This is meant to be like sort of equal access, equal performance. Right?
Not at all, not at all. And if you want to go to the next slide, I can mention a bit like how it does support everyone who is a part of the project. So we arrived at this solution because we thought that it had benefits for all stakeholders. So I'll just bring your attention to a couple of these. I think, as Adianka mentioned, it addresses the barriers of low cost, and ease of use, and the management responsibilities fall to the managed service provider rather to the resident themselves. A managed service provider can fix a fault in the network remotely, and will oftentimes, if they're doing their job right, will know about the fault before the resident would. So now there's a challenge here with the residents, which is that we like to think that we always want to address, which there can be a trust challenge when a network just arrives in your apartment building. And then also we like to, as much as possible, you want to couple these projects with literacy or some type of support, because many of these users can be new to the service. To your point you're making just before, Anthony, for the owners, this sort of gets this upgrades their interior wiring, and should they want to eventually go to fiber or Ethernet to the unit, this creates sort of the first step towards that. The infrastructure that shares the wiring pre-access points can be utilized to then, bring a different connection, which is not access points in the hallway, but access points within the units in the future, which we'll probably see in the future, but we're not there. The usage rates aren't necessary yet. But the challenges for the owners, right? It certainly helps their building marketability and their property value, but there are challenges, and the biggest challenge I would definitely say is operational expenses. There's lots of opportunities, and we need to create more for the capital expenses, but operating gets tough. So I'll just say I'll mention Massachusetts again. In Revere, we worked with we supported the Public Housing Authority and the Massachusetts Broadband Institute and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council to do a network there where the Public Housing Authority is paying the operating costs. In Quincy, the municipality is actually going to assume the costs. And then in Roxbury, there's a nonprofit developer, Urban Edge, who's building a great network for all 880 units, and they will handle, through their own budgeting, the operational expenses. So I would say, I'll add one more for the owners, is that you can find a lot of cost savings through the apartment Wi-Fi solution because you can integrate smart technology, building systems, and find savings within your your heating costs, etc. And lastly, and then I'll stop, is this community, which as we know, all the benefits of broadband access exist, but also, as sort of bringing it back around to Adianka's point, is it makes it efficient use of the federal funds that are available at this moment. This is a landmark moment where we all hope to be able to use these funds that are becoming available, and we don't want to let that go by. I think only part I maybe skipped is that we are also working towards other ways to fund operational costs. Section 8 properties, there is a route that, once again, that NYC Housing and Preservation determined. Public housing has operational costs allowed, but as we know, public housing often has other priorities. And we're working with NTIA and others to sort of figure out the way to allow for those costs to be included in a rental agreement or otherwise.
That's super interesting. On the operational side, some of these are kind of low cost. Are subscriber revenues like any part of that? And is there any consideration? I know when a commercial broadband network is deployed, the sort of take rate, right? Like the percentage of homes that they pass, at which point they break even. Do you guys have a similar kind of consideration? And how does the sort of sign up process in the building work, and where does what's the threshold for sort of success there?
Great question. We have studied that. We have such a focus on public housing, where that solution becomes more difficult to integrate those costs for users. But how should I answer this? In a market rate situation, the provider will provide a door fee. So as soon as I always get confused here. I'm sorry, Anthony. At a certain point, 30 or 40% take rate, the provider oftentimes is able to have their costs paid for. And so what we've seen is a profit sharing agreement over that take rate between the ISP and the housing owner.
Yeah, I guess my question is there's certainly many households where the service is going to be offered for free. Are there cases where people are paying something, but it's not a market rate? And if so, is that part of the business plan for these projects? Or is it basically everyone gets free access and the financing kind of assumes that?
There are some models where the bulk billing model allows for that out-of-pocket cost to the household to be as low as $10 per month. Generally, we see that, especially in the multifamily housing space, providers are willing to enter into bulk billing agreements because they know that a certain level of take rate will be there. And so even if the resident is only paying $10 a month, that is some guaranteed revenue for the minimum threshold of service.
And then on the capital side, you mentioned some federal funds. What are the other sources of funding that have been used to finance the capital expense on these projects?
There are some other states that have allocated state funding. We've been really involved in maximizing the use of California's CASA program. It is a public housing fund that is specifically adopted to address the needs of connectivity in public and affordable housing. So we've worked with public housing associations in those states to help them with their applications. Texas has also recently established a state fund, their Broadband Infrastructure Fund, that will have some dollars allocated towards an MDU connectivity program as well. So we're seeing states step up to fill in that gap. We know that the Infrastructure Act provided great avenues through the BEAD program, even some Digital Equity Act funding that can go towards connectivity and MDUs, as well as the capital project funds awarded by Treasury. But there will still be some need in multifamily housing, and it's exciting to see states stepping up to fill that gap.
Can I also add, in unit connectivity is assumed by NTIA, but there is not direct guidance there. And so some states have said in the BEAD eligible properties, we will expect to the unit connectivity. Others have not, and so there's a challenge there. There's also but where the challenges get lessened is in non-deployment funds. So once again, varies state to state. In some states, there will be money left over after they've connected all the unserved, underserved, and CAIs, and those non-deployment funds come with less restrictions. And we've been pushing non-deployment funding where available as a really great choice for apartment Wi-Fi. Similarly, digital equity funds. Maine has dedicated a pilot program, $2.5 million, to a public housing pilot MDU program. And New Jersey has actually done the same with their non-deployment funds, actually at $20 million. So we're excited to see how those programs roll out.
Great. We had a couple of questions come in. One was just a clarification about, you had said something, I believe, about Section 8 or other HUD funding sources to subsidize operating costs. Could you maybe just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So it actually comes back to your other point, Anthony, which is that HUD, because of internet classification today, HUD will not allow broadband costs to be qualified as a utility cost. So a public housing authority actually is unable to add that charge to a resident or have it be subsidized by HUD. So that's a change that we'd like to see. I was waiting to get that one in. Can you help me out again?
No, I think that was the question. So it's something that you guys are pushing for, not something that exists today. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. And what I will add is that about Section 8, as you mentioned, is that where I've learned that this worked for Section 8, and it can work in a lot of other situations where Section 8 funding can be an allowable use. I'm sorry, broadband funding can be an allowable use for Section 8 for the purpose of Section 8 communication. So Section 8 residents have to be online to pay their rent or be in touch with their administrators. Therefore, that is the justification for being allowed to use broadband funding in Section 8 housing.
Great. This is exactly the kind of thinking that we're hoping to surface here today. Rachel Stark had a question about security and privacy. I was wondering if you wanted to give up a little bit of your privacy and come on camera and share that question with us. If not, I can ask it. I can be your proxy.
Can't hear me.
Is that
Can you hear me
Rachel?
now?
Hi, how are you?
Hey, sorry. Had to go put a kid down for now. So yeah, my question is really, we've done a mesh network system, and the biggest concerns that that residents had in participating, and even some of our officials at the state level were concerned about us having, were around the security, levels of security for folks in home, because like we all are affluent enough to be able to have our internet subscription that we pay for, which is secure, private. We get the demand that we want, and it's meeting our needs. And we have confidence that nobody else is really getting on and hacking us or stealing information, unless answer an email that we shouldn't. But what is there that can be put in place to really make sure that these systems are as secured in people living in these apartment communities?
Rachel, can you tell us where you're joining us from?
Sorry, City of Charlotte, North Carolina.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Again, it comes back to this trust issue, but in terms of technology, the security risk is no greater. What we recommend in apartment Wi-Fi projects is a thing called a pre-shared key, which is essentially a password per unit. And what happens within the unit from a technology standpoint is there's a subnet, there's a network within the property, and so each unit's connection is separated from all the rest. So it doesn't differ very widely from an MDU that has individual subscriptions. So you're able to, with that password, you're able to have service in your unit, but you're also, in many cases, be able to travel through the campus and still remain connected. In everything, it's really important to think about who your partners are. But I would probably say, with the right partner, you're actually more secure because the managed service provider is watching that network. Whereas no one is really necessarily watching your network if Verizon or Time Warner or whoever you may want to is not going to call you if they see a fault or if your network goes down in your house. You have to call them. But in an apartment Wi-Fi project or a managed service project, someone is actively managing that network and will see any security flaws or networks going down. So in some sense, I would say it's actually more secure and safe. The issue becomes the trust and doing a lot of education around the trust to, share what I've said in plain language that everyone can understand and follow.
It's such a great point. I noticed one of the participants on the call is Jill Plotkin, who for many years was part of the team at bway.net, an independent ISP in New York City that differentiated itself during the rise of the big ISPs like AT&T and Earthlink by being a very privacy conscious ISP that was doing that, watching the local network on behalf of its subscribers. So I think Tony's point is really something that we've seen even out in the market. Well, thank you, Education Superhighway folks. I want to switch gears a little bit and welcome Rhea Pape, who's the Executive Director of San Antonio Digital Connect. And I think it's a really opportune moment to think about what is all of the other programming and tissue that needs to be built out around broadband infrastructure in order to enable people to use it, to do the things that they need to do for their livelihood and well-being. San Antonio is a city that has a lot of multifamily housing, a lot of pockets of need. So Rhea, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how this issue looks from your perspective and what it is that San Antonio Digital Connect does. And how the ecosystem you're building out is leveraging both federal funding as well as local and industry partners.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you all, as well as with Education Superhighway, who we've worked with leading up to some of these funds becoming available at the state levels. And so again, excited to be here today. There's lots happening in San Antonio and Bexar County. Our organization, as far as digital equity and digital inclusion work, is happening around our ecosystem. There's a lot going on, but as far as our work in particular, we are tasked with implementing the digital investment plan that was built as a community, private sector, public sector partnership in late 2020, 2021. And so it is a very hefty document that has lots of research and goals and strategies. And so over the past 4 years, we've been doing that work. It's kind of interesting because we're a nonprofit here, but our work is supposed to wrap up at the end of 2026. And so as we have these conversations with our community partners, we are always considering the sustainability of the programming that we're doing now and the support that we're providing now, and how that looks, when SA Digital Connects is no longer around. And that's always been the goal of the partnership. So San Antonio, of course, is the 7th largest city in the country. It's a very sprawling community as well. We have significant number of headquarters here in San Antonio and Bexar County. USAA is headquartered here, Whataburger. We have a Toyota manufacturing plant. So there's a lot, there's a hustle and bustle. But when the pandemic hit and the digital divide became the topic of conversation across the world, really, our organization was sort of spun up and supported by our private sector. So those large organizations that are here in the county, because they had employees that couldn't get online to continue to support their businesses and their work. They, were concerned about the students that couldn't get online and the families that couldn't connect with friends and family across the country. And so the private sector really took the lead on building out this partnership. But one of the key, I know you hear a lot about public-private partnerships. One of the key things that we have within our partnership is the community organization element. We have over 200 community organizations, typically nonprofits, that are doing some sort of digital inclusion work, whether it be like loaning laptops and devices. If they've got a computer lab on site, if they do digital skills training, they're considered one of our 200 plus community organizations. And so I'll go into that in a few minutes, but I think it's helpful to sort of understand the partnership that's put into place has been really what has allowed our community to move forward on some of these much larger projects, like infrastructure projects. So I know there's a couple slides if we're able to share.
Yeah, Jay, are we able to advance? Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, this is just the quick rundown of a little bit of what I talked about. So we've got the partnership. We work to implement the plan. A big focus of ours is to secure local, state, and federal funding opportunities and bring those opportunities to our community. And then facilitate, track, and report progress. So we've got a data tool that we're building out now, actually, to provide some really, I would say, truly local level data that is not typically accessible on some of these larger maps. So that's been a fun project underway, but yeah, if you could go to the next slide, we can really get into the partnership. So this is sort of a layered approach. So the partners at the top, of course, I mentioned our private partners. We've got a lot of great support across the community. I'm actually here at a workshop today with our one of our funders, and they recently donated $21 million to the region, different organizations throughout the region to do more digital equity work in our community. And so we're here collaborating as that grant cohort today. But in addition to our private sector, who's very strong here in the city and the county, is our public sector. So not just the city of San Antonio and Bexar County, who we work very closely with to do a number of projects, and I can talk about that a little bit, but also NTIA and the FCC, as well, of course, as our broadband development office, who've been amazing along the way. We're all sort of building the plane as we're flying it, but you know, they've always been open to feedback and communication, and so that's been really helpful to the people who are sort of on the ground doing the work. Is that our broadband office is open to that, you know, communication and transparency of information. So that's been really key for us. And then, of course, community organizations that we've been working with. So our private sector is really working to fund and amplify our work, and of course, champion things that are happening in our community. Our public sector very much focused on policy, of course, and then you know, we consistently work with them on public comments. So when there's an opportunity from the broadband office to submit public comments on any you know, NOFOs or anything like that, I'll draft something and I'll send it to the City of San Antonio and Bexar County government affairs teams. We'll meet about it, review it together, make additional edits, and then it'll get sent off to the broadband development office as sort of a coalition type document. You know, so we're all aligned. It's very clear that we're all aligned. And then, of course, any work that our community organizations are doing is very focused on residents and direct service to the residents. And so anything that we can do to support that work, we do as well. But some of the key items in particular for our community that we've seen success in is that access piece. And so just this past year, the city and the county, actually, I should say the RFP went out in 2022, but just last year, the contracts were negotiated. The goal was to utilize ARPA funds and any matching dollars from the internet service providers that were willing to respond to the RFP to build out access to as many households as possible. And so what that came to be was that the city of San Antonio contracted with AT&T for a total of their project at $33 million, $33.5 million. The city paying 8.8 of that and AT&T paying the rest. And their work is going to be connecting over 28,000 households by the end of next spring, by next summer. And then our county, Bexar County and Spectrum negotiated their contract at $31.8 million, and the county paid $12 million of that. And they will be building out because it's more rural in those areas. It's less households, similar amount of money, but that'll be just over 12,000 households by the end of 2026. So that number is really amazing for, you know, for our community. In 2021, there was a report, or I should say an assessment that came out that indicated that there were 130 households in our community that did not have access to reliable broadband to their homes. And so just this project alone is addressing that significantly. But we also know that there's been business as usual from not only AT&T and Spectrum, but Google Fiber as well is very active in building out in our community. And so that 130,000 households that were previously not served is very much shrinking. And that is all before, you know, any of that BEAD funding is coming available. And I mention that because, you know, in these larger urban areas, I would say many of them, especially San Antonio and some of the other larger Texas cities that I've spoken with, we're anticipating not seeing much of that money. It's going to go to you know, the unserved and underserved, as y'all were talking about earlier. And what we're finding in Texas especially is that's the more rural areas, and it's not going to be enough. Even the amount of money that we got, which was, you know, the most than any other state by far, is not going to be enough for Texas. So we did have to supplement some of that with that infrastructure fund that Arianka mentioned. So there's $1.5 billion there. We'll see. Another challenge we face with BEAD is that Texas did not include the MDU module into our proposal. And so our Broadband Development Office is going to be separately working on multifamily programming utilizing funds other than BEAD. And so it's different, right? Y'all have been alluding to this the whole time. Every state's different. Every Broadband Development Office is sort of prioritizing different things based on the needs of their communities. And we're lucky to have a great group at the Broadband Office that continues to work with us. But it's really this sort of high level perspective partnership that allows us to see the progress that we're making. And so I just have one more slide just to again, visually like show the partnership. So of course, our private sector, our service providers, I have weekly conversations with AT&T and Spectrum leaders. Similarly, I have weekly conversations with elected officials here at the city level and at the county level. San Antonio is a city manager strong community. And so we work very closely with our city manager as well as our mayor and our county judge who leads the county work and oversees the commissioner's court. So there's lots of conversations that has to happen, lots of opportunities for us as an organization to stay on top of all of the new things, all the new information that comes out on a regular basis, things that we're learning, right? The not just the NOFOs, but the opportunity for public comments and policy work that has to be done in advance of legislative sessions. And so that is the work that we're doing, the conversations that we're consistently having. But we do really like to promote, the idea of the P3 partnership as a model solution for seeing the successes that we have in our community. And we're always happy to, to talk with other communities to do the same.
Great, thank you, Rhea. Yeah, I think it's really important for folks to understand that these broadband deployment projects cannot and do not happen in a vacuum. They need this whole ecosystem of programs and partnerships around them in order to really be effective. I'd like to bring one more guest up front, if we could, Jay. Danny Fuchs, who's with HRNA Advisors, who's been working with the local infrastructure hub on their boot camps around the BEAD and digital equity programs. And Danny, you work with states and cities all the time on these kinds of projects. How does this challenge of connecting up multifamily households, multiple dwelling units look from your perspective? And what are some of the ways you see states and cities kind of trying to get creative in steering some of these federal funds to support this work?
Thanks, Anthony. I have the great good fortune of following two great organizations here, and I'd start by reflecting that doubling down on Estefania's comment in the chat about Rhea's work in San Antonio. I have a little bit of background. I have the great good fortune of working with Methodist Healthcare Ministries and designing their grant program that is providing $21 million in support of that. And then also collaborate and partner with Education Superhighway in a lot of states and cities. I'm really seeing and thinking about three roles for government in this space right now. One is the type of soft but incredibly hard and important leadership that Rhea is providing, of connecting the dots, organizing, advocating, providing technical assistance, offering webinars like this one. That work is so essential, really hard, and requires indefatigable champions that are focusing on it. And it's likely a long-term solution that is going to be needed. And so the cities, the states that are assigning individuals to spend their time to serve as the champion for connectivity in multifamily housing is really, really important. The second role that governments are providing is capital. Delivering capital to build new infrastructure to these buildings. We are helping a number of places try to do that through BEAD, frankly. a lot with the actual in the states that are going to be able to serve their unserved and underserved to get to community anchor institutions. So, for example, we think that there's some really interesting partnerships that we're working on in Clark County, Nevada, which is most people know as Las Vegas, to wind up getting fiber to the premise, and then funding therefore the in-building wiring as well. That can be a big part of what is frankly the biggest challenge in the space is affordability. We're working with a provider a couple providers actually in Las Vegas, where we think that if we deliver infrastructure to the building, they may be able to deliver service at $10 or less per household. That is extraordinary. That's the type of solution that I think is necessary to really close the digital divide here. That leads, though, to the third role, I think, of government here, which is to fund the ongoing subsidies for households to reduce the price or pay for those operating costs. While the Affordable Connectivity Program was totally amazing, I would say that anybody that's considering an ongoing subsidy should probably, hopefully, not be thinking about a $30 per household subsidy. That's not necessary when you do it in a targeted way. We like affordable housing as an asset class for governments to focus on, because if you wind up having government bulk purchasing, which is different than bulk billing, but I'll get to that in a second, then you can wind up reducing the costs a lot. I actually started in this space nearly a decade ago when I was at the New York City Department of City Planning, focusing on the city's capital budget, and the city was developing a program called Queensbridge Connected. Queensbridge is the largest public housing complex in the country, and what the city did was the city bulk purchased internet for every resident in Queensbridge housing. They were able to get that at a very reduced price, like less than half of what ACP winds up providing to a given household. That's because of the economies of scale and the reduction in risk for internet service providers. So those are, I think, three roles of government, and my strong suspicion is that it's the first role, the champion, the coordinator, the connector, the technical assistance provider, the advocate, that winds up unlocking the other two opportunities for government. And I really focus on that. That said, one of the connections is with the providers who are really good in this space and are doing it not from an affordability standpoint, but are doing it from a cold, hard capitalism and economics standpoint. There are apartment Wi-Fi providers that their business model is to sell to large real estate developers bulk purchase agreements for their buildings. So what those providers often wind up doing is winding up selling whole building Wi-Fi at a bulk rate to a landlord, that the landlord then provides free internet to their tenants. That they are doing because what's actually happening is often the landlord is purchasing that internet service for $10, $12, $15 a month, and then jacking up the rents by $50 or $60 a month. So they are seeing it as a revenue source for them. What we are working on with a lot of cities right now and states is, how do you actually reduce that arbitrage that the real estate developers are making all this money on and deliver that savings to the tenants themselves? And so we think actually the real innovation in this space, beyond the deployment of infrastructure to the building and then within the building, is going to be about how do you structure either bulk purchasing agreements or bulk purchase backstops, where the ISP may actually charge the tenant, but the ISP knows that they're going to guarantee that government is going to guarantee them that 35% take rate that Tony mentioned earlier as necessary for them to wind up breaking even or making a profit. And these are the types of things that we're exploring in what I think is the single largest affordable housing broadband program in the country right now. My colleagues Vidi and Ella are on the line, are managing New York State's $100 million affordable housing connectivity program, which is funded by the Capital Projects Fund from Treasury. The design of that is to eliminate the need for any additional capital investment from the private sector so that they can then deliver much more affordable rates to tenants in affordable housing properties.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, I think if nothing, it highlights just how many different ways there are to structure and fund these projects, and that we have like a huge array of potential partners to bring on board for all the different stages of the project. We're nearing the end of our hour. James just posted the second poll, which is giving you a chance to kind of reflect a little bit on what you may have learned today. We hope it was a lot. And I want to ask each of our panelists. Adiinka had to go to another meeting, but we thank her for sharing her knowledge with us. And go around with our guests and ask them to reflect on one piece of advice that you would have for the cities on the call today, as that they can take away as they think about how they might either pursue apartment Wi-Fi solutions with or without potential federal funding to support those efforts. So Tony, maybe we'll start with you and then go in order.
Sure. You cut me off at the pass of advocacy to your state broadband office to understand what can be made available to your city. And I think so what I would say, what I'd add is sort of doubling down on what Danny said, which is that thinking about the power you have by aggregating your properties and creating portfolios of properties under management or under supervision control of the municipality. Because if you offer, 8,000 units to a ISP, you're going to get a great price, So thinking strategically about where your leverage is, and I can definitely say that like bundling those properties is where you'll find a lot of leverage. And of course, my nonprofit side would also consider the other legs of the stool, devices and literacy. Dropping technology into a community without those other supports can oftentimes not be very successful.
Thank you. Rita? Sure,
yeah, just to sort of piggyback on that, my first thought was like, have a strategy, right? And so don't hesitate to pick up the phone, send an email, call someone else who is doing similar work. There's no reason to be shy in this space, right? We're all sort of figuring it out. And so, I think it's a lot easier to go to an ISP and say, this is what we want to do. In a lot of cases, depending on who you're talking to, they may not know MDU is a problem, right? Or an issue that can be solved by what they're doing. And so really sort of having your go-to documentation that says, here's the data that says what our community needs. Here is the proposed solution for how we fill those gaps. And, part of that strategy, to Tony's point, is that it's not just about the access. That comprehensive strategy truly is about closing or bridging the digital divide. And that is much more than just access to reliable internet in your homes. It goes much beyond that. And so the more comprehensive of a strategy you have, I think the more, not just the more serious, but the more willing some of these service providers are going to be to jump on board and put their name behind that.
And I would close by saying the next greatest opportunity for doing exactly that is what Jamie put in the chat, the Digital Equity Competitive Grant. And I would encourage, if you do not have a program for that yet, thinking about an asset-based approach in affordable or multifamily housing to go pursue that application, and think about what partners you may have in your state or across states to aggregate the types of solutions that we're talking about here through that opportunity. But
And
hopefully,
this program is directly eligible for municipalities, correct?
yes, it is.
Okay. So yeah, that'll be next Tuesday, July 30th. The registration link is at the bottom. And our next Tech and Innovation Center series will be, we skip August for summer vacation. We'll be back on September 25th. And we are exploring a session around use of generative AI for grant writing and grant reporting. So Jamie's smiling because she's super excited about this topic. So we'll be working hard on that through the month of August, and we will see you in September. And just a round of thanks to all of our guests and our participants.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much,
Bye-bye.
guys. See you soon.
Take care.